Welcome to Vibrant Publishers podcast, where we bring you engaging interviews with distinguished experts across diverse fields. Today, we are joined by Dr. Lane Cohee, who is an associate professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University, where he joined in 2017. He provides MBA and undergraduate instruction in the areas of project management, operations and supply chain management, organizational behavior, international management, and strategy. Previously, he served as an associate dean, MBA chair, AACSB initial accreditation campaign leader, and strategic planning committee chair, resulting in successful AACSB accreditation of Marshall E. Rinker Senior School of Business in May 2023. Prior to joining PBA, Dr. Lane spent 30 years in the defense and aerospace sector, most recently serving as an executive director of program management at then Harris Corporation, where he also served as the executive committee chair for program management. In total, he has over 25 years of project program management experience. He holds bachelor's in science, United States Air Force Academy, MBA from University of Redlands, Masters of Education from University of Colorado, and Doctor of Business Administration from Rollins College. He has held his PMI PMP certification since 1999. Dr. Lane, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicole. Nice to be with you.
Same here. So, can you share a bit about your journey, this 30-year career in defense and aerospace industry to becoming an associate professor of management?
Sure. So as you said, I spent 30 years in defense and aerospace, 7 years as a commissioned officer in the Air Force, where I did some acquisition, project, program management, and then transitioned gradually into more project management and then full-time program management and what PMI calls portfolio management, which is a general manager role over products and programs, which is the last role that I held at Harris. I knew at some point in time, probably 10 years ago, that I wanted to transition more into the area of learning and development. I've always loved the classroom. I've loved the learning environment. I love helping others develop in terms of their skill sets. I didn't know exactly what that looked like for me, but I knew it involved going and doing my doctorate, which I did 10 years ago. And then I had the opportunity to join the faculty at Palm Beach Atlantic, and that just kind of fell on my lap. And so I took advantage of that. When I came here, I wasn't focused on project management. Primarily, I was a management instructor in a number of those other fields that you mentioned, but I noticed that we had a gap. We didn't have any undergraduate project management, and we didn't have any project management in our MBA curriculum, and I decided there could be a differentiator there for us, at least providing our students with that exposure. And so I developed that curriculum. And simultaneously, I've been doing primarily training, but some project management consulting, like a lot of professors do on the side. So that's kind of my journey and how I continued to use the skill sets that I had developed in the industry.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So, if would you like to share which one do you prefer more? Do you prefer being in the industry or do you love the educational role?
There's great aspects to both. It's a great question. I'm not a pure academic in the sense, obviously, that I grew up, doing my PhD and have lived in academia for 30 years. And so I still kind of gravitate more naturally towards being a practitioner. But there's great elements to both. I love the practitioner side, but I also love the learning environment in the classroom. And so what I've tried to do is kind of take the best of both worlds.
That's great. Now, how did your experiences in executive leadership at Harris Corporation influence your approach to project management, education and consulting?
Well, as I mentioned, the last 7 years that I was at Harris, and now it's L3 Harris, they merged with L3 a couple of years ago. I had an opportunity to have an executive leadership role where I was running a line of business that had a number of projects and programs and products as well. And that just naturally kind of led me to being more and more interested in the field of that dovetailed with my doctorate, which was in the whole area of business administration. And I saw all of the elements of it, from strategy to operations to finance to manufacturing, so I kind of got the whole gamut, and then that just lended itself well to being able to teach at the faculty level. So that kind of led me down that path. And then, as I said, where we had a gap in the area of project management, I feel like I was able to fill that with some of more specific knowledge that I had acquired over my career, and I've continued that here at PBA.
Right, got it. And talking about project management, what, in your opinion, are the key principles that contribute to a successful project execution?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have, every time I teach project management, whether it's in a pure academic environment or whether it's in a corporate or government training environment, I always share what I call my 21+1 recommendations for tomorrow's project managers. And we don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll throw out a couple that I think are critical. And ironically, almost all of them have to do with the people side of project management. Obviously, there's a whole technical side and tools and techniques, but I find that the most important elements of successful project management still reside with the way in which you can build your team and operate as a coach. And so one of the things you have to be committed to is being a problem solver. If you don't like solving problems, you're probably in the wrong line of business, because in my experience, you're going to have, people outside your door on a daily basis coming to you, asking your opinion, asking for direction, asking for guidance. And to some degree, that also requires that you be a planner. You need to be thinking ahead. I say, if you're not planning 3 steps ahead, and you're behind, because if you walk into a meeting and you're not prepared, or if you walk into an engagement and you're not prepared, people get a feel for that, and you're trying to set a tempo and a cadence. You're trying to set an example for your team, and so preparedness, I would say, is essential. Keeping your eye on the ball and staying undistracted from what I call minutia and noise, because it's very easy, especially in large programs, to get distracted, and you have to keep your eye on the target. I would also include, and I'll just throw out a couple more, self-leadership. You can't effectively lead others if you can't lead yourself. And, so having good emotional intelligence, having good assessments, good self-regulation, which, I'm always personally struggling with, that's just terribly important. And I would say also be a relationship builder. I was reflecting on some of the hardest challenges that I had, and even though I'm kind of a personal introvert, you have to be actively engaged with your stakeholders, your customers. You've got to be aligned with your customer. You've got to be aligned with your suppliers, with your senior executive leadership. You've got to constantly be engaging in stakeholder management / leadership in order to be effective. So I wouldn't say that those are the only ones, but those are a few, at least, that I've learned.
Okay, you mentioned problem solving skills are a very key part in project management. So do you think it's a skill which can be worked upon and developed, or is it something that one needs to know about themselves, and if they don't have those skills, they should probably not go for project management?
Well, I think most things in life, there's a little bit of born and there's a little bit of bred. I think some of us are more naturally inclined to, I'm a very linear thinker, probably too much of a linear thinker, but I do tend to think of things in terms of sequence and schemas and relationships, and my brain operates that way. So problem solving comes a little bit more naturally to me, at least the kinds that we do in programs and projects. But that doesn't mean that it can't be developed. I think if you think about there's a lot of areas for cognitive development. I think there's a lot of areas where you can kind of grow in your critical thinking, which is really what it comes down to. And so I would say it's a little bit of both. It's nice if you come out of the box with some of those natural abilities, innate abilities, but I would not say all hope is lost if you have some learning and development to do. You just have to focus on it, and practice it.
Right. So Dr. Lane, I would like to say that we also had a podcast with one of our authors who is also a project manager, and she said that even she personally is an introvert. And
Yeah.
you said the same thing. I just wanted to know that does that mean that being an introvert or extrovert doesn't really matter when it comes to roles of project management?
Yeah, it's interesting. Research would indicate that from a leadership perspective, extroverts are going to be a little bit more naturally inclined because, let's face it, you're getting out in front of people. You feel comfortable in terms of relationships, where introverts are a little bit more guarded in that area. But there's also research that indicates that introverts have a little bit of special sauce, as we say, as well. And that sometimes is, a lot of times we do a lot of internal processing and thinking before we lead with some of our thoughts and solutions. And that can be a benefit because sometimes you run into a highly extroverted person, particularly if they're an idea person, and they're throwing all kinds of ideas around, and you're just trying to, where are we going here? And that's really hard when you're trying to operationalize ideas. And so extroversion helps in that in some regards, but sometimes introversion, where we're thinking through things and we're really not putting our fully cooked ideas on the table until we've really had an opportunity to process them, that can be very valuable as well. I'll say one other thing. I'm a personal introvert, but I'm a stage extrovert. And so when I get up on stage, and a lot of people are like this, I kind of flip and I get more animated, I think, and so that is helpful because you do have to do, at least for larger projects and programs, when you have 100 people in the room and you're trying to communicate the value of the project and you're trying to keep people motivated, that is a helpful skill to have to be a strong communicator in front of audiences.
Okay, so I guess that's good news.
Give up if I was it. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I would not give up because I was an introvert in terms of project management.
I was saying it's a good news for the introverts. All they need
Yeah.
is to develop on their public speaking skills.
Yeah, and you just have to work at the relationships and the teams, but and you'll probably come home a little more exhausted.
Right.
So you have to recharge. But introverts have ways of being able to adapt to the situation as well. When you need to come out of your shell because there's a purpose for it, you can do it, and then you get back into your shell again.
Right. All right. So, could you share a memorable project in your project management field, a challenge that you faced in your career, and how you navigated through it?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a bit because there's a number of them. They tend to be turnarounds. I'll share with you one. This is about a little over 10 years ago, but it was a big program. So when I got into the executive ranks, and I said I was responsible for a portfolio of programs and projects. That was in mid 2011, and I inherited a program that was, I think if we were to put it in today's dollars, it would have been about a $1.2 billion program. So it was a pretty good sized program, but it was a program that consisted of both what we call the first article development and then a transition to production, where we were producing these very large satellite communication terminals that were deployed worldwide. And so there was a lot of scale. It was a very complex system. And we knew that in order to win the job, that we had to bid very aggressively. And we knew that early on during the first article phase, it was going to be a real challenge. But we didn't know how much of a challenge it was going to be. And I inherited it. It was significantly behind, significantly over cost, and things were trending in the wrong direction. And I could spend 30 minutes talking about it, but in a nutshell, what we had to do, and it took time, it took literally took 3 years to get ourselves fully dug out of the problem, but
Right.
on a 10-year program. But some key things that we did. First of all, we had to reinforce the relationship with the customer. The customer was starting to get uncertain, and we needed to demonstrate that we knew what we were talking about and that we still had credibility even though we were behind. Some of that also involved me making some changes in the leadership, and they were not necessarily popular changes at the time, but they were things that I felt were necessary because I needed the right person in the right job at the right time. Some other things that we did were we had to actively work with our suppliers. We had a supplier that was significantly challenged, and we had to go in and basically sit with them and work with them and kind of build them up in order to get them to be successful, because if they weren't, we weren't going to be. We had to work with our operations team extensively to work out workflow issues and that sort of thing. We had to overhaul our test and evaluation approach that we were doing. We had to build additional test assets early so that we could get more testing done faster when we got to the test phase. We had to go to 24/7 testing and coordinate with our government customer to witness that 24/7, which wasn't necessarily an easy thing to do. We had some hard-nosed negotiation that we needed to do with the government at the end in order for them to agree that we could transition into the production phase. But when we got there and we had a major milestone in mid 2015 called Initial Operating Capability, IOC, and when we got there, you know, it was all smiles. We had turned it around. We were in full-scale production. We were now profitable, but it took us 3 strong years and the better part of 4 years to get to a place where we were officially in a good spot. And then after that, the 5 or 6 years that followed were good production years for us. But it was a hard turnaround job, and there was no silver bullet. It was just a number of different things. But I will say one closing thing. It was a matter of maintaining credibility with your customer, with your suppliers, with your executive leadership, getting support from your executive leadership, and constantly communicating that although we were struggling, we knew where we were and we knew what we needed to do to get this problem resolved. And if you kept the communication going and kept the confidence level higher, and then of course you had to rally your team. So it was a tough few years.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. But during this process, what made you have confidence that the process was going to be a successful one? Was it the data? Was it pure confidence in your team? What exactly was it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say confidence in the team and confidence that I had the backing of my senior leadership. And that was very important because we had to make a significant financial investment to get ourselves out of trouble. If my leadership had said, you know, we're not going to work with you, you're on your own, and this is what I mean by stakeholder relationships, there's no way that we could have turned it around, because we needed program investment, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of program investment in order for us to get these additional systems built so that we could compress our test schedule. But I needed the right team, and in some cases, I had great people that were just not the right people at that time. I needed firefighters. I needed people who were a little bit harder edged. The program manager that I ultimately selected for that had more of a, you know, he was very focused, very, direct in some cases. And he wasn't the right person, interestingly, for the job after we got to full scale production, because then there was another skill set that was required. But at that moment, we needed a real, more directive personality and somebody who was more of a linear thinker. And so I was confident in him. And I was also confident in the team that we would eventually figure it out, and we eventually did. It just took us longer than any of us would have thought.
So my next question to you is that while teaching, how do you incorporate real-world industry experience into your teaching to prepare the students for challenges they might face in their careers?
Yeah, it depends on the audience. So, I teach undergraduate and MBA students, but I also do corporate training and work with people who are in the business. And so for all of them, I have stories like the one I told you, and I'll try to, condense it a little bit so I'm not just rambling on and on. But I have written down a lot of stories over the years, so I try to provide real life stories like we just talked about as examples. Obviously, that gives them some sense. But if I'm dealing with someone who's a project or program manager in the trade, I might throw some ideas out there and then ask them, what are their experiences, and then we'll try to connect experiences together. Because if you can find yourself speaking the language of the student, then you're going to connect a whole lot better. Now, with undergrads and junior MBA students, they haven't run these kinds of large programs, and they may never run a large program, but they've coordinated a design project. They've done an event plan. They've maybe done a wedding plan. They've done a study abroad activity. They've even planned a vacation. And so you can take basic project management, truisms, and still apply them to smaller projects that they will understand. And so you're trying to get a balance between the two.
Right. Got it. Now, you talked about your experience in handling a huge team. So could you elaborate on how you can ensure collaboration and communication among diverse team members working on complex projects? And there might be conflicts involved as well. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, there are always conflicts. So, even since I've left industry, even though I stay in touch because I do a lot of the training and consulting, obviously we've seen a kind of an exponential growth in terms of collaboration tools, particularly driven by the pandemic or through the pandemic. So, the Teams and the Slack and all of the collaborative tools that we have. And that's fantastic. I think, you do need to educate yourself on what collaboration tools work well, and make that investment. But I think it still requires, you're still dealing with people, and people are the ones who are collaborating and coordinating. And so we are people who need some discipline. I was just talking to somebody who was asking my opinion yesterday about, how to work a little bit more collaboratively with her boss, who was trying to take a more senior role. And I said, why don't you, establish some timeframes in which you meet on a recurring basis and you go through, and it's not unlike a little bit like a stand-up or maybe a scrum, where you're enforcing to some degree some repetitive communication that's happening across the team. Now that could be obviously a project or program manager and their leadership, or it could be across the lower levels of the team. The other thing, to take advantage of nowadays is what we're doing right now. For example, just today, I had a question from a student on a paper, and I knew this is a new type of paper that I've asked for, a research paper. So I just made a quick 4 or 5 minute video. This is what I'm thinking. I shot it out. 35 people received it. So we have tools available to us that we didn't have available to us even a few years ago to improve that, if we're thoughtful about the way in which we can communicate. But I would say, multiple methods of what I call multiple modalities, more information richness, especially if we're in, distributed environment, and then also a cadence that we can, kind of a structure that we can sign up to, or a battle rhythm, as we used to call it, is also very important. And the last thing I'll say, you asked me about conflict, and a lot of times people will say, either avoid conflict or don't avoid conflict. And most project and program managers are, don't avoid conflict because conflict can be a good thing. Well, that's true, and it's not true. And if you study it, it's like there's nuances. So there's dysfunctional conflict, like if you were looking at the US yesterday and you saw that Senate hearing where the senator wanted to get up and fight the Teamster, that's unhealthy dysfunctional conflict. That kind of conflict is almost never profitable, and that needs to really be nipped in the bud. But there's also constructive conflict, and that usually comes in the form of not personal, but task-focused conflict, where people are not, it's not that they don't like each other, or it's not that, but they have very different ideas about the way in which the task ought to be done. And we used to call that, to some degree, constructive dissatisfaction, where we wanted to encourage some disagreement on, because we believed that you could kind of sharpen the problem solving. So conflict, keep the conflict focused on the task, not on the people. We don't want people with interpersonal issues. And when that happens, we need to pull people into the office and work through that. But we do want to encourage constructive disagreement as long as we can come to a good conflict resolution process where everybody feels that they're heard in the process.
Right. Thank you for sharing your insights on that. Now, how do you approach project planning? And if you could share any methodologies or tools you find effective for creating realistic schedules, project schedules?
Yeah, I'm probably fairly old school in this regard, in as much as the larger project and program planning that I've done over my career has tended to be a little bit more on the traditional or predictive side. So we did a lot of upfront planning. We had a very detailed process with regard to how we established work breakdown structures, and did our scope planning, and we did obviously our schedule and cost baselines associated with that, and everything kind of centered around the WBS as like a standard traditional program plan. Obviously the people side, getting the right people on the organization, putting the stakeholder management plan, putting the supplemental plans together. So a lot of upfront kind of work. Now that approach works for some projects and it doesn't work for others. I've also worked on projects where we did very little amount of planning, and it was kind of figure it out as you go, more adaptive in nature. So really what you have to do is you have to find what type of planning works. I just led, for example, our AACSB, which is the top tier business school accreditation for business schools. And I used a lot of project management methodologies to do it because I was familiar with them. But for that, I didn't do a WBS. I just put a project schedule together with key tasks that needed to be done. And I put some, key activities in, like putting a charter together and just task definitions and a little bit of process into the systems that would be helpful. And that was good enough. So I think I've just explained very heavy level of planning, and we used to do a lot of that when I was at Harris, and very light level of planning, and then maybe something that's kind of in between. And it really just comes down to, what does the project need to be effective? We don't need to do too much. We don't need to do too little. We want to try to find what we call the Goldilocks principle, which is just the right level of planning for the project.
Okay, got it. And with the growing popularity of agile methodologies, what are your views on it, and how do you see its impact on the traditional project management? And when would you recommend using agile?
Yeah. So the textbook definition, of course, for the use of agile is when you can't or don't want to plan the entire project up front. When there's so much change being introduced, usually technological change, but usually technological change throughout the life cycle of the project, that that if you wait to deliver all in one fell swoop at the end of 5 years, your technology is going to be obsolete, and you probably will not have hit your milestones anyway. So change, high level of customer intimacy, inability or undesirableness to plan everything up front, and where things are obviously in transition rapidly, and we need to get product out as soon as possible that is value to the customer. So those are kind of your traditional textbook kinds of things. I've seen agile work extremely well, and I've seen Agile work very poorly, and it has nothing to do with Agile. So back, I'll date myself a little bit, but before Agile was a term, I was working with a small software development company. We were, if you're familiar, CMM or CMMI level 1. I mean, we had virtually no process, but we were very specialized, and we had a lot of control over our requirements, which is another key element of Agile. And so we used what used to be called rapid application development before Agile was a thing. And we were extremely successful in terms of being able to do that, but we would not have been able to scale that success beyond the specific area that we knew extremely well, because we had a lot of subject matter expertise in that area that we could transition. Later on, our solution actually got adopted by a large defense contractor, the largest in the world. And they came in, they said, where's your documentation? Where's your architecture diagrams? Where's your, where's your system diagrams? And we were like, we have a database schema that we operate from, and they just couldn't understand how we could have done it. But we were small teams, Agile. We were closely collaborative, Agile. We had a lot of customer feedback from our own team, Agile, and we were very specialized. And so that worked exceptionally well. On the flip side, I was an independent reviewer a few years ago for a team that was very focused on Agile, but the structure was absolutely not conducive to it. The contract definition was not conducive to it. The customer was not conducive to it. The program team didn't, the leadership of the program team really didn't understand what Agile was. The executive leadership team definitely did not understand what Agile was. And these were some, gung-ho motivated software developers who thought that this was the way in which it should be done. And maybe it could have been, but the environment was totally wrong. And so what I always say to anybody is, it's not Agile or traditional or hybrid or whatever, it's getting the right development approach under the right environment and circumstances and situations and technical solution. So long answer, but hopefully that helps.
I think that would help a lot, because there's a lot of confusion with so many methodologies out there. So would you say that it needs to be adaptive according to the project?
Yeah, and first of all, I think we should probably avoid some of the almost religious warfare that we have between Agile and traditional. I mean, it's almost become it's kind of a cultural thing. The question is, what works for the project? If you have a number of tools in the tool chest, figure out the tools that you need for the project and adapt accordingly. In that one that I was telling you about, an Agile methodology worked exceptionally well. In the one that the latter one, it wasn't because Agile is not a good development approach. Obviously, it's very proven in certain environments, but for that environment, with that contract structure, with that customer, with that executive leadership and that program team knowledge, it was destined to lead to failure.
Okay, thank you so much for the clarification. Now, plans usually do not go as they have been made. There are a lot of deviations as well. So how do you handle deviations from original plans? What are your methods for that?
Well, my background is using pretty traditional earned value methods, and in a traditional job, I would continue to use earned value methodology. It is heavy, and it's not necessary for every project, but if you have some project with some scale and some scope, it is a good methodology to use if it's applied correctly. So obviously you've got your baseline, and then you have variances off of your baseline, and you manage to the variances to the degree that you can. Now, where obviously you have to think about other alternatives is like the large program I told you about, where we had to basically rebaseline the program. And I've been in programs where we've had to rebaseline many times. Again, you get to a point where the schedule that we've got, the cost, the cost profile that we've got, this is not. We basically need to do a replan. And so if you're in a customer environment where you're working with your customer, that's that's a heavy conversation that you're going to have with your customer, to explain that and to negotiate that and to work that out, like we did with the terminal development that I told you about earlier. You hope that you can use good change management approaches and good, resolving your variances and that sort of thing to stay on your plan. But if you can't, you need to be wise enough to know when it is that you have to ask for help, or do some renegotiation. And every project or program is going to be a little bit different.
Right, correct. Thank you for you sharing your insights on project management topic. Now, my last question to you would be, what advice you would like to give to individuals who are looking to advance their careers in project management, and what skills or qualities do you believe are essential for the success in this field?
Yeah, I shared a few of the skills. I'll share a few more that might be helpful. Project management, it's this interesting. You're really a coach at the end of the day as a project or program manager. It's the closest analog that I can follow. Some people talk about a conductor of an orchestra. That's true, but you're really like a coach. And if you think about in the US, our football, you're going to be the head coach. You're going to have a lot of specialists underneath you. You're going to have line coaches. You're going to have offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, special teams, all that. So you need to be comfortable with letting other people be the experts. You're not the expert. You're the person who's pulling it all together and coordinating and integrating and communicating. So you really have to be a team builder. You have to set a standard for your people. You have to be a person who can communicate with credibility. You need to know when to push and when to relax, because we can't sprint marathons. You need to be politically aware. Politics is the way it just is, and you need to be situationally aware as to what's going on. You need to build those stakeholder relationships. You just have to kind of be person who's willing to be comfortable operating at a level that's not necessarily absolutely down and in. One of the biggest mistakes that we can make is maybe we came out of engineering, maybe we came out of finance, maybe we came out of contracts, whatever, and we know that stuff very well, and we default to going back to that. And you can't do that as a project manager with scale. You've got to get yourself at a level where you're operating, And so that said, I would say, as a young undergraduate, perhaps a new grad coming out of school thinking, I really think this project management stuff is for me, like I started doing in the mid-90s. Don't assume that you're just going to be able to immediately go into a project or program management role. You usually have to develop some knowledge of the industry, some knowledge of the field. Like I could not go run medical, projects or a project for a finance team, probably, because that's not my background. So you kind of have to grow up a little bit in a specific industry and understand the industry and the lingo and the relationships and all that sort of thing in order for it to make sense. So be willing to develop into a project or program management role. Sometimes you can get a scheduler role and you can start working on schedules and learning it kind of that way, which is helpful. But be willing to also announce your intentions. And I'll leave you with this. When I went to Harris Corporation, then Harris Corporation, in 2004, and I did it for one and only one reason, which is I wanted to be a manager of large programs. And I wanted to be able to move up the ladder, as it were, with larger and larger programs. I had to really communicate, sometimes very forcefully, what my career objectives were. I knew what I wanted to do. And sometimes they were like, no, we really like you in engineering. And it's like, no, you don't get it. I did engineering, but that's not what I'm going to do next. And we had to have some hard conversations. And eventually I was able to get into that role, and the rest is history. But you do have to sometimes be sure that you communicate your intentions if you want to go down that career field. But be willing to learn what you need to learn in the industry before you jump into a project or program management role.
Okay, got it. Dr. Lane, thank you for being with us today and for sharing your valuable insights. And to our audience, We appreciate your active participation, and we hope you enjoyed the podcast and found it both engaging and thought-provoking. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It was great chatting with you.
Same here. Thank you.